First thing to say is, whilst this is a webinar, which is almost another name for a broadcast, I think the whole value of live webinars is actually questions, and you guys will get the opportunity to answer any questions that you've got. Both Chris and I, as we go through, will keep an eye on the Q&A section. The chat panel is open, but it can be a bit harder to keep on top of the chat. So if you do have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A. You can also vote on other people's questions, so we'll try and get to as many of those as possible. In terms of the format, so we've got this for an hour. We are hoping to cover the meat of the kind of insight report in the first 40 minutes. If we stick to that, I'll be amazed, but that's certainly the intention. And then ideally we leave kind of 15-20 minutes at the end for questions. But as I say, if you have questions as you go through, we'll do our best to pick those up as we go. So, needs-based budgeting and GAG pooling, a sector update, okay? There's lots that we're going to cover during the course of the next 40 odd minutes. Partly it's going to be a bit of a history. We're only going to go back 12 months in terms of how is the sector evolving on some of these topics over the last 12 months. But the main thrust of the session will be focused around the insight report that ourselves at IMP Software did and Chris at CJK Associates did just before Christmas. That's going to be the majority of the session. But before we get into the meat of it, I need to introduce our esteemed friend Chris from CJK, who has been a really helpful part of the process in us creating the Insight panel, and also has a lot of sector experience in precisely these areas, and will be delivering a lot of this session. So I'll hand over, Chris, for you to introduce yourself and CJK.
Great, thanks, Will. I was looking around for the esteemed one. Must be somewhere behind us. Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Chris Kirk. I can see a few familiar names on the participant list, so that's always nice. So CJK Associates, we spend probably half of our time working with multi-academy trusts. I guess we specialise in sort of helping with growing pains, helping to get rid of them, hopefully not causing them. As trusts grow, they tend to go through quite a few inflection points where they need to think about their whole operating model in terms of organisation, systems, business processes, we have some ways to help with that in terms of some tools and some support. And so that's what we do. And as you can see, we've got sort of specialists in various areas who are associates who support me. And on the right hand side, you can see some of the trusts we've worked with, and I also teach a masterclass with Confederation of School Trusts on building your central services, and you can see my blogs and articles on my LinkedIn page or on our website. We also spend a bit of time actually working with suppliers, so we tend to be fairly up to date on which suppliers are doing what, who's being bought by whom, and hopefully therefore can bring a bit more insight to our trust clients in terms of what's hot and what's not in terms of the systems that you can select from. So that's us. Thanks, Will.
Brilliant. You're also very good at succinct introductions, something that's going to be highlighted when I go introduce myself and IMP. So obviously great to see so many contacts and customers on the list. There's a lot of people on this as well that we don't know. So for those of you, my name is Will Jordan. I'm co-founder and CEO at IMP Software. As a business, we just hit our 5th birthday a week ago, and we provide budgeting, forecasting and reporting software designed specifically for multi-academy trusts. As at the beginning of last year, we also added a slight extension to the budgeting and forecasting piece to cover ICFP or CLFP or curriculum planning, or however you wish to describe it, but ultimately an integrated approach for all of those processes that is designed specifically for multi-academy trusts. We don't have any standalone schools, we don't have any maintained schools, any FE colleges, all focused around multi-academy trusts. And a lot of what I'll be talking about today is also around the work that we do with, we've now got, as of last week, we crossed the 4,000 schools mark, so we work with 400 trusts of all different shapes and sizes. And the interesting part is that whilst there's 400 trusts, you all do things very differently. And that's something that both Chris and I are going to be quite conscious of as we go through this session. We will be talking about things that people are doing, but we won't be saying you should or shouldn't do. There might be a few things you shouldn't do, but there's probably less you should do this or this, because ultimately trusts are all on this journey. There's a correlation between the direction of travel, but actually trusts do things differently, and part of your challenge is navigating those waters. So we're working with about 400 trusts. A very simple approach to what we do is we pull all of your data out of your finance system. We combine that with your forward-looking information to give you your projected outturn for the end of this year and for future years. Because we integrate with all of those systems, we also synchronize the chart of accounts, so there's no need to do kind of manual additions or changes at the end of the sales pitch. Okay, we had how many minutes? So it was less succinct than Chris, but let's say 3 minutes on IMP introduction. Would love to speak to any of you around your budgeting, forecasting, ICFP or reporting. But back to the topic in hand around kind of what's happening with GAG pooling and centralization. And the first thing to note is we're not going to answer this question on the screen during this session, because top slicing or GAG pooling is not a binary debate in terms of one is better, one is worse. There are pros and cons for all of them, and actually there is a big range of what people actually mean when saying the term GAG pooling or pooling, because depending where you draw the line on the definition, top slicing is a form of GAG pooling. So it's a very difficult topic. We're trying to tackle it in terms of what we're seeing in terms of the evolution of GAG pooling, but it's worth noting that it's quite a difficult topic to discuss given the different things people mean and understand when they talk about it. But that is something that we've tried to capture via the research. So we will try to dig down on, well, actually GAG pooling is one term, but the reality is there's lots of different applications. So we'll get to that. The first thing we'll start with is kind of what are we seeing in the sector over the last 12 months. And the first thing that I was quite surprised to see, maybe I wasn't surprised, but I was startled, again, maybe not startled, I took notice of was the Creston benchmarking report last year, so the one that was launched at the beginning of 2023. For the first time, they asked the question around, are there trusts actively doing or considering GAG pooling? And for the first time, I saw a stat somewhere that indicated a majority was thinking about or doing GAG pooling. And we've been talking about GAG pooling for a good number of years, and the trajectory has been increasing throughout that period, but it has been moving from 10 to 20 to 25 to 30. And whilst this is one stat from one report, to be honest, it did set the scene for the year and sets the scene a little bit for what we're going to talk about later on, but a fairly steep increase in people thinking about or doing pooling. And then that was coupled with a couple of other things that came out in the course of last year. So the first thing, if you haven't already seen this, it's well worth a look. There is a QR code there that you can scan and go and have a look at. But ultimately, the Multi-Academy Trust Leadership Development Chief Executive Officer Content Framework is a really pragmatic guide, which is all around that strong trust agenda. There's lots of sections in there, but the section that I always skip straight through to is the one around finance and operations, and how you can ensure that financial management and operational systems are there to enhance the sustainability and deliver growth for the trust. So that's the section, but within there, I was quite surprised to see the following kind of statements. There was a section that was talking about it's important that you're able to direct the trust's activities to achieve the most efficient and sustainable provision of education by the highest quality, prioritising and making the most effective use of public funds by, one, embedding ICFP, yep, get that. Number two, ensuring that resource allocation across schools in the trust has sound rationale and transparency. And then I put this in bold, including by instilling collective trust-wide responsibility for all pupils attending trust schools. And I was really surprised to see that kind of sentence, because that is very similar to how I hear a lot of people describing their approach and their rationale for GAG pooling. And to be fair, it wasn't called out as GAG pooling, and there might be an innocent explanation, but that felt quite deliberate to me in terms of, that statement is very GAG pooling-esque. I don't know, Chris, if you've got anything on that particular comment, or whether I'm just being a conspiracy theorist in my judge of these.
I mean, it could be, and when you sort of link it to, I think, what you're going to talk about next in terms of the sort of steer towards further centralisation, I think it could be. But You're absolutely right that when we ask or talk to trusts who've sort of been successfully moving towards GAG pooling, the first thing is kind of do school leaders agree with that sentiment? Because kind of if people don't and they feel that it's more resources are there for the individual schools, then it's harder to move towards GAG pooling. And look, as you said right at the start, Will, there's an argument for both. You and I don't bring a sort of value judgment to that, but just it is a statement that does fit well with the value side of moving towards GAG pooling.
And I was surprised to see it. I must admit, I was surprised at seeing something so deliberate. And then the next thing that I probably timed that intervention wrong, Chris, because the next bit further enhances this feeling like further emphasis on the topic of GAG pooling from the ESFA or the DFE. And I don't know that many of you do this, but the types of people that we are at IMP, we have a look at the wording in the 2022 Academy Trust Handbook, and we compare that to the wording in the 2023 Academy Trust Handbook. And when you compare the description of GAG pooling in 2022 to the description in 2023, which I won't read out, but I'll let you read, that's quite an evolution in the course of 12 months, and a not so subtle, I think, indication of their intentions and their growing feeling, and that GAG pooling could be a useful tool in the armories of multi-academy trusts. When we then combine that with the Creston benchmarking report that was launched a month or so ago, first thing is it talks around the kind of continual changing trajectory of top slicing, and it was quite interesting on this. Up to a year ago, the sector was converging to a 5% top slice. So that was trusts were going up from 2 or 3% to 5%, but also trusts were going down from 7, 8 and 6% to 5%. A year ago, that bucked the trend because it shifted from a 5% joining of the sector, and that jumped up to more like 6 and 7. And you can actually see that they've now done that analysis this year based around trust size. So there's certainly over the last 2 years, the percentage of top slice central recharge, the percentage of GAG income is potentially increasing as trusts grow and evolve. And when you then add on to that the insight that they gave around GAG pooling, again, a fairly steep trajectory when you take each year by itself. And if you actually take the percentage increase, 29 to 42%, that's a big old jump in the course of 12 months, and it feels like that trajectory is not going to slow anytime soon. And not trying to steal the thunder of the next part, the summary is: a year ago, 54% of trusts were actively doing it or actively considering it. There have been multiple kind of items in the last 12 months that have come out from the regulators that would infer kind of a softening towards GAG pooling, and then Creston has kind of set that scene earlier this year with the growing numbers. What's quite interesting, I did a session similar to this at the CST conference a few weeks ago, and there were some senior colleagues in there from the SFA who was part of this session, and one part at the end, and I won't talk about that, it says that there are a percentage of people that do not want to do GAG pooling or do not think GAG pooling is going to be good for their trust. And in a conversation I had afterwards, they were talking about, well, it's quite interesting, maybe we should do some education to that portion of the sector, and I thought that was quite interesting because that inferring again conspiracy theories and reading between the lines, which is what kind of we're led to do on these things, does feel quite very direct. If they're thinking about how do we educate trusts that don't want to do it, that does feel like a continuation of this trend around the softening views towards GAG pooling. So that's a bit of a scene setter in terms of what's happening in the past 12 months, and I'll just hand over to Chris now for the next part, introducing the next bit.
Thanks, Will. Just finding my mute off button there and talking about rusty Zoom skills. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that we've done, or introduce that, and then I'll talk about some of the early findings, and then I'll hand back to Will. So, I mean, Will and I last did a piece of research a bit like this, which I think you can still find online. It's about 18 months ago now, and I think we both are involved in a lot of discussions with Matt who want to know more about it, and in particular, we felt there's kind of what are people doing, but also how are they doing it? So we're going to be bringing you some of our findings on not just what, but how, and sort of how are they evaluating it. So that was a bit of the focus. But just to get into that, let me just talk about the research itself. Next slide, please, Will. Always wanted to do that.
Talking about COVID throwbacks.
Yeah, COVID throwback. So yeah, you can see that it's a pretty healthy sample size, 155. They are all kind of senior leadership roles, and I don't know, show of hands of who's a CFO on the call here or sort of related to that, but there's obviously very strong interest in this from the CFO community. Over half of them COOs, and you know, some CEOs as well. So it's a strategic, well-informed view, I think we can safely say, that we're going to bring to you from the research. In terms of the distribution of those trusts, again, sort of no surprise when you see that shape. That is pretty well the distribution that you see nationally. So, you know, we see that as a good thing. We're broadly in line with national views. Inevitably, we don't have as many views from the larger trusts because we are kind of more in line with that. But obviously, they do actually represent very large numbers of academies. So, you know, if you smooth that out and did it by academy, it would probably be quite a straight line. So again, a good kind of representative view. It's not just all large or all small. So let me move on to the first of our findings. Before we got into GAG pooling itself, we just wanted to get the latest picture in terms of how people are choosing to sort of distribute their staffing. And at CJK, one of the things we do is look at a function like, say, finance or HR or estates IT, end to end in terms of all the people involved, the processes are involved in, and the activity. And from that, in a CJK study, we would then produce an actual sort of benchmarked activity cost. But in this case, we just asked, to keep it simple, about the organisational arrangements. And rather than a kind of a rather woolly question about how centralised are you, sort of high, medium, low, which I think is quite a subjective answer. So people don't necessarily know what a more centralised arrangement might look like if they're not in it. We ask a very specific question, which is about line management. So we basically offer three choices. All of our local operation teams are line managed by school leadership, which I suppose would be sort of the starting point as a trust, if you like, inherits local authority maintained schools, if that's, you know, where the schools were coming from, or SATs. Or a mix of local and central management, which would be that kind of hybrid arrangement, or moving into all staff managed centrally, even those based on school sites. And what we can see is, you know, finance is probably not surprisingly the first function that tends to become fully centrally managed, and 58% of the trusts who answered this have end-to-end financial management. And, you know, that gives you the opportunity to reshape teams, reshape business processes, ensure things are done in the way that you need them centrally rather than sort of having them done locally and then quality assuring and reviewing centrally. But there are still a good proportion of trusts who do things through a mixture of that, and a pretty small proportion, now only 8%, where all of the local operations are done by school leadership. And we can see that HR is the next down that line. You know, sort of similar discussion. Do you have end-to-end site of HR in terms of all HR activities, or is quite a lot still done by a mixture of, you know, HR administrators and head teachers, PAs, and all the other kind of people who would be involved in operating HR at a school level? And it's a fairly similar answer for HR. And then, I mean, IT, I was interested to see this high. I don't think it was this high last time we did it. So that dark purple line implies that everyone down to and including kind of school technicians on site, all kind of network management and support is reporting to a single central trust IT director. And, you know, that's also pretty high now. The majority of trusts are in that model. That's the last function where the majority of trusts do it like that. Once we move into procurement and health and safety and safeguarding, you can see that you start to get the mix and match model becoming much more the dominant one. And for facilities, which, you know, obviously the kind of on the ground work is irreducibly going to be local in terms of sort of local site maintenance, and also where sometimes trusts that are very geographically dispersed can find it hard to add much value with central or regional tiers of management. You do see that sort of slightly lower pattern, but nonetheless, there's about 30% of trusts who now have end-to-end facilities, and that would mean that site managers, estates staff, even on site, caretakers, etc., sort of have a professional line of sight on their management, rather than that going through the school leadership staff. And for trusts where that's working well, school leaders will say, that's great because somebody else is sort of dealing with all of that, and I'm sort of knowing that I've got that service being delivered well for me. For trusts where it's going badly, they'll say, we've got conflicting priorities now for my site staff between what I want as a head teacher in terms of a clean and tidy site and what the trust wants, which is to get the risk register down in terms of things like PAT testing and, loads of compliance that we can't really see, don't really enjoy, but know it needs to be done. So, theme of this session, we're not saying one way is better than another. There are pros and cons, but you can see a real direction of travel now. And the reason we're interested in that is that it links to how you distribute your finances, because if all that work's being done centrally, you're going to find it hard to then say, we're only going to charge you 3 or 4% as a top slice. And it starts to shift the argument towards, okay, if we're going to deliver a lot of things for the schools, we're going to need to put the funding and resources for that with the people who've got accountability for it, which is probably a central budget. Is that best done through increasing our top slice, charging a service charge, or GAG pooling? And we see all three of those arrangements, but I would say those dark purple trusts are the more likely ones to be moving towards GAG pooling. Right, thanks, Will. And then I think I've got one more slide on that, which is so how centralized will you go in future? And it's interesting. We said IT is already moving towards fairly centralized, but that's the one where there's the most impetus. Half of the trusts said that they would want to be more centralized in future in IT. And I think cybersecurity, the need for specialist IT role families, that the challenges of kind of procuring and managing an ever more complex IT estate tend to lend themselves towards people wanting to centralize, or in some cases centralize and then outsource. And obviously we didn't sort of ask about in-house, out-house, which is another interesting dimension of this. And if we put it on that chart on the right, just because I'm a management consultant, I have to put things on a 2x2 matrix every other slide. We can basically see that IT is the one that's already most centralized, but also with most desire for further centralization, and safeguarding is the one that is local and seems likely to stay much more local, and sort of you can see the reasons why that would be. So yeah, those are my thoughts, Will. I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
I suppose probably the one that surprised me the most is around health and safety, and it might be a definition challenge. But referring back to your early comment around estates being focused on risk register and compliance, I would have assumed that would then also extend to health and safety provision being very centralized, if not 100% centralized. Like, I'm struggling to see the local health and safety. I suppose there's accountability and the work done, but that did surprise me.
I think it, as you say, probably what you need, Will, is a full CJK review to take it into its constituent bits, of course.
Perfect.
But as a single bucket, you're right. It contains everything from, perhaps your system where you log your health and safety issues. I would hope generally you're going to just use one of those and have a standard way of logging things into it, and sort of maybe trust level and exec level compliance, which again I would expect to be centralized. Compared to all of the health and safety tasks to be done. And actually, if you're in a model where most of your facilities staff, your local staff, are locally managed, then your actual delivery of that would still be local. If you just briefly flick back to the previous one, because I think it's quite interesting. If you look at facilities, only a third are centrally managed, so you kind of couldn't really deliver health and safety in a more centralized way. You can certainly put in place the systems and the policies and the processes, but you're still going to need people on the ground to do it. Well, the people are going to be on the ground anyway, but they're going to be locally managed in that sort of lighter pink and middle sort of mixed model and locally managed model.
Perfect. My colour blindness really holds me back when you're talking about these colours, because I think he's referring to this one, but I won't guess because I'll make myself look very silly.
Well, this was in branding. They were in beautifully distinct shades of blue when they left me.
I know. Okay, great. Well, that's kind of touched on centralisation, and the summary is a lot of centralization and a lot more desire for further centralization, which if you put that into the context of the kind of strong trust definition that both come out from CST and some of that, the MAP development or CO development framework, it's certainly direction of travel around centralized services, good, effective centralized services being an enabler for trust. So perhaps not surprised to see so much of that. We're just going to jump now to the kind of the pooling part and reserves pooling or GAG pooling, and just introduce some of those findings. And this first one is.
Can I just butt in really quickly, Will? Sorry,
Yes,
Michelle.
yes,
Michelle has her hand up, and I don't know if we've got capacity to take sort of. I don't. Are we set up to take spoken?
No. I saw a load of hands go up when you said, put your hand up if you're a CFO, Chris, and I don't know if it's a legacy of that.
It may have been legacy from that. Oh, apologies. Yeah, it was a stupid thing to say. If you do have questions, I think for now, if you don't mind sticking them on the chat, just because I think there's about 200 of us on the call. But yeah, if you've got a question, please do stick it on the webinar chat if you can find that.
Yeah.
If you're not used to Zoom, it should be in the middle of your screen on the bottom.
Yeah. There's a few coming in now, and I'll go through, looking at the nature of them, I'll go through the next couple of slides and then potentially circle back to them. So the next slide is then the kind of the headline findings around do you want to pull, and my screen share is hovering above this text here, so I'm trying to see it, but ultimately I think we're saying 50% of trusts are pooling reserves, okay, but a further 30% would like to in the future, and it wasn't quite that extent, but there was a lot of kind of deliberate answers. And the first thing that I noticed on this was when we asked these questions 18 months ago or 2.5 years ago, there was probably a bigger proportion on the fence in terms of I don't knows, and it feels like over the last couple of years there's been kind of enough information around the sector, enough stories that people are sharing around, good and bad, around what some of these things can do, and therefore people are deciding which side of the fence they're on, rather than potentially 18 months or 2 years ago there was less information, there was quite a lot of not misunderstanding, but a lack of clarity of what GAG pooling actually meant. I still don't know there's full clarity on that, but hopefully some of the next slides will dig down into that a bit more. But there is a difference in feeling between those wanting to pool reserves and those wanting to pull GAG. So in terms of, if we look at what people are already doing, there is a near majority of people already pooling, and a much lower percentage than GAG pooling in terms of reserves. But in terms of ambition to do more in the future, GAG pooling does nick that in terms of there is more ambition to add that. In terms of what this then kind of comes back to as a formula, 80% of trusts, if we take people's intentions from this survey, it does indicate that 80% of the trusts in the sector will be pooling reserves and 60% of trusts in the sector will be pooling GAG, which is a pretty strong finding. And whilst the trajectory around increasing GAG pooling has been there, and we've kind of kept track of that over the last 2 or 3 years, and highlighting those things that have come out in the last 12 months, I was quite surprised actually to see such a strong finding in terms of feeling towards either a GAG pooling or reserves pooling. But yeah, there is still a bit of a mixture in terms of the current position. So that's the theory, that everybody that wants to do it does actually achieve it, which is an assumption I wouldn't make, but that is quite a strong finding in terms of GAG pooling, that again 60% of trusts will pool GAG in the future and 80% will pool reserves. But the question that always comes, and part of the challenge around discussing GAG pooling, or even people's views on for or against GAG pooling, is, well, actually, what does that mean? Because there are lots of types of things that can look and feel very different at both trust and school level, but all fall under the banner of GAG pooling. And I think if we asked the question around how do you feel about this form of GAG pooling, this form of GAG, I think you'd get differing results. So we have done that on the next slide, is then to ask the people around their views on what they want to do, is twofold. So the first question is around how do you currently approach GAG pooling? Okay, so for those that are already GAG pooling, which was 31 in the survey, there was a pretty sizable majority leaning towards the needs-based model / ICFP. So my interpretation of that is that they are pooling funds GAG or other income streams, and those income streams are not going straight out allocated to the schools to be spent. Those funds are coming to the centre, and then the trust, in conjunction with their schools, are then allocating those resources out based upon need. A need is a very subjective term because depending on the trust, depending on the vision, depending on the ethos, depending of the context, need will potentially vary over time. But ultimately, need and priority of what we want to deliver is what drives the allocation of funds. And ICFP is a mechanism that you can use to understand need and also understand current actual staffing levels versus need. But ultimately, the principle of I'm going to allocate the funding based upon need and priorities across my trust is now the strong favourite of those trusts that are GAG pooling. And the boring old accountant in me that talks about, well, actually every pound is important, the principle of, well, every pound is allocated based upon need, not based on a funding formula, I can get behind as an accountant. And that over time has actually changed quite significantly. So when we did this a couple of years ago, GAG pooling, going back 2-3 years, was more often a revised model of funding for a variety of reasons. But actually GAG pooling was, well, we're going to do our own funding mechanism, and that's GAG pooling. Whereas now GAG pooling, based off of this survey, is leaning people towards, well, actually GAG pooling enables us to pool our reserves and then allocate based on need and priority. In second place, with not an insignificant amount, was around, not the most favourable term, but the opposite of the top slice, which is the bottom slice or the family mat. We've seen this in a number of smaller trusts where they say, well, look, we're 4 schools or 5 schools, therefore we're one trust, we're one organisation with multiple campuses, and therefore we're just going to run one budget. A CEO who was on a earlier panel that we did actually described their approach to GAG pooling as the same as their family, in the fact that, look, he had 3 children and his children have differing needs at differing times. So he had a son that was going off to secondary school, and therefore that son needed some investment for a new laptop or some new equipment. And he used the same analogy in terms of how he manages the schools, is the school's needs will vary over time. Some needs more and less depending on their circumstances. But overall, we're trying to do the best for every single one of our schools or every single one of our children, and therefore that's what drives the funding, not a funding formula. There was a good chunk here for top slice, Matt. So a continuation of local budgets with a high degree of pooling for central services. That feels like almost central services plus. So just a greater degree of centralisation to fund those central services. And then the last one is still there, and it is still something that we see, where GAG pooling is all of the funds come into the centre, and then there is an allocation model based upon factors, and those factors will vary depending on the context of the trust, but one of those factors will be need. It may be deprivation, it may be a range of things, but ultimately a revised funding formula, and in this case they were doing it because they've got schools across different local authorities, and therefore they were trying to even out the funding across there. The next question we asked was then around, okay, for those of you that are intending to do it in the future, which method do you intend to do? So we wanted to see if there was a difference between trusts that were doing it and trusts that weren't doing it, and the intention. And to be honest, the only real difference that jumped out was around the bigger portion around the continuation of local budgets with high degree of pooling for central services. So it felt like there was a need to centralise more of the funding. I'm assuming in response to the earlier slides around, we have centralised more of the operations and services that we offer, and therefore GAG pooling was seen as a mechanism to fund those services. But other than that, it pretty well tracks in terms of the approaches to GAG pooling that people are doing. I was just going to pause at this point before we go into the next point, just because I saw some questions. So the first one, Patrick, is there a minimum size of MAT where GAG pooling is likely to be preferable? I don't know if we looked at it by trust size, Chris, did we? Well, we did, and actually there wasn't much difference.
We did, and there wasn't much difference. I would like to sort of bit of a health warning over sample sizes,
Yeah.
but Yeah, I don't really think that it's particularly a size dependent decision. And, a small trust that sets itself up from the start with that expectation could very easily gag pool, and just start off with, the notion of kind of shared services and reallocation based on ICFP. And I do know of trusts that have done that. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
That was pretty clear a year ago in terms of it did feel like there was a difference between intention between large and small trusts, but if anything, it's easier for small trusts to do it. The larger you get as a trust, implementing any change, be that an MIS system or an approach to gag pooling or anything else, the bigger you are, the harder it gets, and therefore I've got a number of 2 school, 3 school trusts, and I must admit the way they do gag pooling does feel more like the family man. Look, we're one trust, we're 5 schools, we're the same size as a secondary school, therefore we're just going to run one budget and do our best for everybody. Okay, you've got Benedict around terminology. It's easy to see the benefits of shared services when you reach critical size. You can secure efficiencies and build expertise. The term centralisation is not really helpful, I believe, when approaching new schools, which might imply some transfer of power. But in reality, it's more about the centre serving the schools rather than the other way around. That is a centralization and autonomy, these are words that get banded around when we talk about multi-academy trusts, and neither of them are particularly helpful, because what does centralization mean and what does autonomy mean is a webinar topic for its own right. But it is fair to say trusts would say centralization and services are there to probably increase the standard of provision across schools and also take away the burden from schools to help them in a very generalized sense. But you're right, centralization, when I'm a school looking to join a trust, can be seen as, okay, a reduction of my autonomy, and it is certainly a continuing tussle. It seemed to miss the point that the trust signs the funding agreement with the SFA, so accountability for their income sits with the trust board. Very fair point, Mark. The funding agreement is with the trust board, and you are equally accountable for every child in your school. So the accountability is already there, and therefore choosing the funding model that fits best for you to enact your accountability is part of this. One question, last one from Alex Small around what are special mats doing? It's a very difficult question. Well, it's not very. The answer is lots of different things. I don't know, Chris, if you've had any insight or things that you're seeing.
There was a related question from D, which apologies I answered, so it's gone off the open list and onto the answered list, which was specifically about gag pooling within a mixed economy of mainstream and special schools. The mats I'm aware of that have a mix of special and mainstream wouldn't tend to mix the gag between the mainstream and special. They'll tend to ring fence the special schools gag and probably have a central recharge. However, I'm speaking from a handful of mats I'm aware of who have that arrangement. So I've sort of stand to be corrected if people on the call have got a mixture of special and mainstream and pool it all. So I think where it's mixed, generally, I think it does get ring fenced. Where it's special only, we've got an answer from Tams in there. We're a special school mat and pool the place funding. So there's an example.
Yeah, we've seen trusts pool special funding, and we've seen other trusts ring fence special funding. We've seen trusts pool pupil premium, which had some similarities with special funding, and their rationale on that was, well, we are considering our pupil premium strategy and delivery as a trust, and therefore we are pooling that funding to enable our service. So they're not ring fencing it to the schools, other than the children in the schools are the recipient of the service and delivery around pupil premium.
Yeah, but I suppose a cautionary tale or a sort of an example of that. A trust that we were working with relatively recently, where gag pooling was in place with ICFP, including pooling of pupil premium funds. But talking to the head teachers, they were then still asked to provide some kind of report on, pupil premium impact, and understandably said, well, we don't know because we weren't allocated the funds in that way. So I think one of the important things here is the whole design has to be coherent.
Yeah.
funding, delegation scheme, which GAG pooling is really just one form of a funding delegation scheme, has to sit in line with accountability, reporting, and line management. Otherwise, you may be asking people to take accountability for things that they don't any longer have the means for. That's a really important feature.
The last question I was going to pick on, just conscious of time, somehow it's already 15:40. Benedict's question around how do you manage benchmarking in a GAG pooled environment, which is a really common question and something that we get asked a lot in terms of the budgeting system. Other than the obvious answer of, well, it varies, I would say there is some commonality starting to emerge. So with the older style GAG pooling, where there was uh, a quite a frequent version of putting the income into the centre and then reallocating it out based on a formula, that made things quite challenging. What we're seeing more frequently now, and I would say the vast majority are, well, actually income and expenditure still sits within the school that it is due or it happens, but who then sees that is the question mark. So whilst funding might not be part of the head teacher's finance reports, because actually they're in a GAG pooled environment, the funding is still applied to each school. So as a trust, you can still see the income and expenditure position for each school, even though, well, funding is visible and accountable centrally, estates is visible and accountable centrally. So we would see in most instances, income and expenditure still sitting in the school that it is due, but then choosing on a reporting function who gets to see that, because that means you can then still look at your KPIs around teaching costs as a percentage of revenue income and all of those other things, but you're not having to then worry about head teachers seeing things that they're not accountable for, or central teams seeing things that they're not accountable for. I'm just going to jump on to the next part. We were going to stop 20 minutes early for questions, but if we can weave them through, then we can go right up to the wire. The next bit was then around, well, actually, what are the benefits? So all of this talk about GAG pooling and what you do and why. What are the benefits that you are seeing, or what were the benefits that drove you to do this or consider to do this? And there was quite a lot of similarities, but one was around support for small schools and economies of scale. So as a trust with lots of small schools, a small school is a really small unit to balance, and therefore things can happen within that school that can really impact the budget over a longer term. By pooling those schools together, you should have less peaks and troughs and impacts within that, because you can manage that at trust level. Cultural shifts in unified trust. There are a number of trusts that are saying, well, actually, our vision as a trust is to become one organisation and do the best for every single child in our care, and therefore, actually, GAG pooling does seem to fit that vision. Clear accountability and fair funding. So having accountability and also the budget is important. So with trust centralising more, and you might have a director of estates, it is difficult for the director of estates to be accountable for the estate strategy and delivery if the estate's budget sits with head teachers for each school. So actually clearing up that accountability and making sure budgets sit in the right place. Flexibility and targeted investment. So COVID was a really good example of this. COVID happens, IT needs updating quite dramatically in a short space of time. If you're relying on school budgets to do that trust-wide project, that could take a long time, and that might not be okay as a trust. But by able to manage these projects that are trust priorities, not within the individual school budgets, enables them to target that investment quicker. Equitable funding and operational efficiencies. So they are, this is probably more on the geographical revised funding model. Actually, if they're holding each of their head teachers to account, a revised formula will do that and even out some of those funding differences. And then the last one is around strategic planning over the medium term. So it's saying, well, look, we are funding education, and our job as a trust is to give you the best services that we can as educators and get out of your way. So you can focus on education, we can focus on the rest of the stuff. There are a whole host more that come out through the paper, but I'm just going to take this point now to move on from the what part to the how part, and Chris is just going to run through the next few slides around how did some of these processes happen.
Great, thanks, Will. So as we've said, GAG pooling can work out well, or it may not work out so well, and how you do it is obviously really important. So we were keen to ask people, and we asked them about whether they consulted, whether they piloted, how they went about implementation, and sort of how they've evaluated. And we've got a slide for each of those. So the consultation size, quite a few people did speak about quite an inclusive process. In some cases, taking years of discussion as to whether this was the way to go, and some of the questions, concerns raised on the chat here were relevant, which we'll talk about actually. That question about whether you disincentivize the more successful schools, that certainly does come up in all of those kind of consultation processes. Sometimes kind of starting with some consultation, writing it down, trying it. Writing some policy, iterating, but to be frank, the bottle model, sometimes people just made a pretty top-down decision to pool. Probably if you had schools that were more vulnerable and leaders sort of were leaning in, stepping in, and wanting to make some change quickly, grab the reins as it were, then sometimes you will see it being done in a top-down way, and that really very much depends on the trust's context at that point in time. So if I move on then to piloting, I think the answer was, to be frank, most of the respondents said that they didn't really do much piloting, probably because it's not an easy thing to pilot for a bit of the trust. So most people, having discussed it, went straight for it, and also sort of felt that doing it more quickly, everyone at once, and was actually less painful. But there was some what people saw as piloting was to do the revenue pooling first before moving to GAG pooling, which I suppose was a way of testing this piece of, is it all for one and one for all, or do we see each school as having its own entitlement that's based on what the government formula says it is. And in some cases, I guess, a kind of piloting in a sense of, look, we're going to start doing it like this. We're not sure we've totally got the policy right. Let's listen, and change quickly as we go, which seems to me to be a very sensible way to proceed. Then moving on from piloting into the actual implementation, really spending some time getting the policy clear, outlining, your understanding of both the strengths and the weaknesses, and hopefully the paper we've done will really help you to draw on evidence for that, so that, we're not just saying this is a panacea. We have thought about the risks and we've got ways to mitigate them. We understand what we're going into, illustrating the model. I would say making sure you've got a good process for doing the allocation before you move into implementing it, and you'd be surprised how many trusts have kind of put it in place and then kind of created that annual budget cycle, or had to revise the annual budget cycle rather post hoc. I would say, and not just because Will's on the call, but I mean, having a really good tool for doing ICFP in a way that isn't painful and can be part of the normal financial planning process can really help to make this clear. Getting buy-in from all those with a kind of role in this process is going to be important, especially and ideally head teachers, and identifying and mitigating the issues as they come up, and having a really clear and transparent process. I mean, one trust I worked with felt that the GAG pooling process was very unclear. It was very unclear why they got the money they did. They felt that those who sort of shouted loudest were kind of getting more money without there being much clarity about how that was done, and that can be an issue both for reserves and capital funding and for revenue funding. What we don't want to end up with is this kind of very old-fashioned model where the centre holds it and sort of gives it out by decree, and you end up with a lot of bidding and lobbying needed. I think that's not a good way to go, and it is a risk if you move towards GAG pooling that you will end up with that model. So being very aware of that in advance is excuse me, very important. And then second part on implementation, getting the systems and software ready, thinking about bank accounts, thinking about the finance system, thinking about alignment with rollout of financial software like IMP. I mean, I'm amazed it name checks IMP there, Will. That's astonishing. Human factors, the leadership training. One question that comes up a lot, actually, if you move towards this model is, are we disempowering head teachers? And that's a really important question, and it depends on, again, your view of what a head teacher's main job is. The ICFP process, together with thinking about the total needs of the schools and the resources they need, is just as much of a process around resource planning as any other. And head teachers, as the leaders of those schools, should be, in my view, involved in that, because they're still going to be accountable for the outcomes on their school site. But will they be involved in as much kind of technical conversations about the allocation of specific budgets outside what's being pulled to them? I mean, they won't be. But it does allow a very sharp focus on the resources that are there to support teaching and learning at the school site. Rollout and timelines is a really kind of very wide variation. No particular model, but I would say a few months for development and consultation, certainly, and then a year that's seen as a little bit of a test and learn, with a lot of openness and honesty about things that are working well and things that need to be changed, and constantly reviewing. Which brings us on, I think, to the final point on implementation, which is, I think, again, there wasn't that much about sort of formal reviewing, but I would say, that would be a good idea to kind of note in a board paper that you will kind of go back and recirculate around the stakeholders. What did we get compared to what we hoped we'd get? I think that would be good practice. I'm not sure we saw a huge amount of that, but certainly we did see more kind of evidence of people making adjustments based on feedback that came to them. And interestingly, one leader who essentially inherited a GAG pool situation essentially moved back to local funding delegation with top slicing, having inherited a trust with GAG pooling. I think that was the only one that we came across in our sample who'd done that. And it kind of points to one of the questions on our Q&A here, and to the point we made right at the start. If you don't sort of feel at the outset of this that every leader is there responsible for every child, and that the resources allocated to support each child, then I think that will be a stumbling block. So in the case of James's question there about a large successful school, it's a question, I suppose, of their view of sort of civic duty, and if that currently but if that extends to their school at the moment, and it's legitimate, it does, joining a trust, may not be the right step, because once you're in the trust, if you do want to sort of see your duty as extending beyond that school, then you're going to have to make compromises, not all of which are always going to go in favour of the school you started with. And to the point about vulnerable pupils and vulnerable schools, quite a large part of what GAG pooling will do is perhaps allow the trust as a group to think about social justice, and that may come to different conclusions from what a national formula would be. And so there's a nice sort of moral maze, I think, in that. But if your starting point is that you're there for every child and you're there to sort of ensure social justice for every child, then you probably can square that with being a large, successful school that joins a GAG pooling environment and supports out others. And then just a signpost towards our report. In it, you'll find at the end a series of case studies, because seeing the sort of overall statistics is always very useful in terms of how groups are distributed, but what's really interesting is following some journeys through from start to finish. So this is one example of a 21 school trust that uses curriculum-based budgets plus pupil premium and local authority indicators. And in this case, this sort of familiar theme that it was about looking after financially weaker schools, able to drive trust-wide projects, financial efficiencies, moving resources between schools. There was a little bit of consultation here, and there's actually a transition period over several years, starting with reserves and then moving into full kind of curriculum pooling. and there was some piloting some schools where it happened earlier than others, and that was kind of more behind the scenes rather than sort of with a big bang. And I think what's important here is, the trustee commitment and the SLT and being able to sort of understand and explain, plus the head teachers understanding that this went hand in hand with some freedom from admin activities. And they seem to be, quite pleased with the results. So there's some more case studies like that. Back to you, Will.
Yeah, and I think there was a consistent strand that was kind of coming through these case studies and even the conversations that I've had around a lot of the processes were embarked upon with an acknowledgement of we don't have all the answers yet. So it was very much, look, this is the strategy, this is the vision, this is what we're trying to achieve, and we think GAG pooling can help that. And as an organisation, we think this approach to GAG pooling will enable us to do so. But it was quite common that it was, but we're not pretending this is definitely the right answer. We think it's going to achieve some things, but genuine, open, and consultative approach to, and then to say, well, look, and we will revise things that aren't working was quite embedded throughout a number of the responses. Just picking up a few questions before we finish up. So on James's point around large, successful, well-funded schools disincentivise from joining trustee GAG pool. Obviously, you've got Chris's point around kind of the civic duty piece, and you can understand the argument around less schools. I've put this question to other CEOs that do it, and they say, look, a rising tide raises all ships. And if you are a school in a strong trust that is able to deliver outstanding things for all of their pupils, you don't have winners and losers. Now, that's a great answer from a marketing perspective, but he really deeply believed in that. And a number of trusts really deeply believe that actually we are better as a group, and those wins and losses over time will leave us all as winners. But it's a fair point. If growth is on your horizon, you've got to manage that. Anita was around, GAG pooling led to any perverse incentives. I've seen this more with reserves pooling, if I'm honest. So the answer is yes, probably. I wouldn't say yes uniformly, and it's all part of that cultural piece that you need to really have that strong culture and that shared ethos around we're trying to do the best for every child in our trust before you really go near this. But I would say reserves pooling felt to me like more risk of that. So, you've got a head teacher that's worked out, if I overspend on my budget while reserves go back into the centre at the end of the year, it's the same principle. If I clock onto that and I can get away with that, why wouldn't I? It introduced poorly or not being managed effectively, there is the risk of that, and therefore good performance management, and also that cultural cohesion around we're all in this for these reasons. We'll have some of the things, but it's certainly a risk. And then I was just going to move on to the last part of the presentation, and probably going back to Paul. Sorry, so Paul's question around balancing funding streams and affluent areas and less affluent areas receiving different funding, and chucking SEN into the mix. That does look like a really difficult set of circumstances, Paul, to balance. Ultimately, how bold do you want to, or are you able to go with GAG pooling? Because the purest sense of GAG pooling is we put all the money in one pot and we allocate that based on need. You can then define what that need is. You might define need doesn't correlate with the deprivation statistics or the SEN, or you might find that it does. But GAG pooling potentially gives you the ability to navigate those scenarios, albeit it's certainly not without its challenges, given those varying funding amounts. So a bit I was just going to finish up on, conscious that we've just gone over. One thing to say as well is when you leave this session, you'll be rerouted to a landing page where you can download the copy of the report. So these are kind of the highlights that's got a lot of the information, but you will be forwarded to the landing page that will let you see that. But the last bit to finish on is actually, we've talked a lot about the reasons for GAG pooling, what people like about it and how they did it. But sorry, the first thing I do is people rating their GAG pooling move and would they recommend it to others, and actually it was pretty positive. That sort of response in terms of would you recommend your approach to peers, it is people marking their own homework, which is a caveat we should add, but it is pretty strong. And when we looked at the types of GAG pooling, there was more in the needs-based ICFP approach towards the more positive end than some of the other options. But there was a third of people that didn't want a gag pool, and I think the questions have summed up a number of those challenges and thoughts as to either why people don't want to do it, or why people feel they're unable to do it, and there will be a mixture of those within here. But a big chunk of those were around funds are allocated to students specifically in that school, that local piece. School autonomy, very similar. That question is almost word for word what James put in. Uneven starting positions is a challenge. If you've got some schools that have really high reserves to begin with and some schools without, well, actually that's quite a painful conversation, and that could be quite detrimental to culture, particularly if that depends on the beauty parade that was done in the initial days to kind of get everybody on board. So if it was all the CEO going out and saying, "Yep, come and join our trust, nothing will change, you keep all your reserves," that could be at odds and could certainly make things challenges. And there's some other options there. There was a number of people that trust the national funding formula. I've been waiting for the national funding formula for some time, and actually that is a fair allocation of funds, and we don't think as a trust we can do a better job. And there was other reasons that were similar to the previous slide. You'll shortly be on the landing page where you can download the paper where you can look at these in a bit more detail. But it's fair to say, 34% are not drinking from the GAG pooling Kool-Aid, and there are lots of really understandable reasons as to why. Outside of the sector, GAG pooling is not shy of its critics. Okay, so there was a think tank report released in January that talked around the state of the education sector, and one of the things that got fairly squarely rejected was around GAG pooling and saying that should be banned. With political changes potentially on the horizon, it's an interesting topic, and we'll see how this kind of continues to evolve in the next few months. That draws the end of the session. Sorry we overrun slightly on time, but thanks for all of the questions that we put in. I hope that's just giving you a bit of a summary of what's happening and the types of approaches that's out there in the sector. You'll be receiving the copy of the paper with more detail. But yeah, thanks very much for spending an hour and a little bit of your time this afternoon for this webinar. Thanks also, Chris, for helping us with the research, and also joining me this afternoon as well. And we'll be sticking around with some questions now if you have any. Otherwise, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Will, actually, I have to, I'm afraid, go and join another session. Is that okay if I leave you to it?
That is fine. Thank you very much, Chris.
Great to see you all, and catch you soon. I hope you enjoyed the report. Thanks, Will.
Thanks. Okay, interesting question from Benedict actually around how do you keep school leaders motivated when they're performing well, and how much visibility do they have on their long-term planning? I suppose two questions. Hopefully if they're performing well, they're involved in the GAG pooling mechanisms, and therefore they are involved in defining what the need is for that school. There will always be some potential disagreements between the head teacher's definition of need and potentially the director of secondary or the director of primary, or however that kind of need debate has happened. But assuming there's not a massive difference, because you wouldn't expect there to be a huge deviation on those. And then how much visibility do they have on their long-term planning? That's a really interesting question, and I would say, and this is not anything we've done from a research perspective, but what we generally see is this year and next year. Okay, so there are 5-year curriculum plans. Our ICFP tool rolls out to 5 years, and that gives you a direction of travel. But I think in reality, this year and next year, unless there are significant birth rate challenges on the horizon, is generally the amount of kind of financial runway they're given. Claire, happy to, if you drop me an email, Claire, happy to send over these slides if that would be helpful. And for anyone else, it will all be in the report that you can download, and it will be a bit probably hopefully nicer presented in that report. But if anybody would like a copy of these slides as well, please drop me an email on Will at IMP Software, and happy to help. And Mark, yeah, please drop me an email. No, Rowena, as soon as you close Zoom, you should automatically be signposted. It should automatically open up the landing page where you can download the report. If not, give any of us a shout and we can send it over. Did you see a mixed approach in schools with secondaries and primaries, as in one pool for the secondaries and one pool for the primaries? I haven't seen kind of two different approaches, Ruth, but need is defined differently across primaries and secondaries. So yes and no is the not very helpful answer you weren't looking for, I'm afraid. ICFP is different for primaries and secondaries. In secondaries, it's much more focused around the breadth of the curriculum and what that timetable piece looks like. Whereas in primaries, it's probably much more focused on deployment of leadership and TAs, because there isn't really the breadth of the curriculum. You've got the class structures and the average class sizes, but actually it's more focused around some of those kind of TAs or even admin staff, which is less of a focus at secondary school. So they are different, but I haven't seen kind of two different pools that are then kind of divvied out for each one. But it's certainly tough. Implications on our IMP software for moving over to GAG pooling. Hopefully, Jill, minimal, because the most popular form of GAG pooling is to leave the income in the schools that generate it. But then from a reporting perspective, you then on a cost center basis say, is this a central cost center or is this a local cost center? There are slight deviations around, you could have extra granularity there, but broadly, everything within the school is either a school thing or a central thing. If it's a school thing, it will only the school things are on the report to the head teachers. The central things are on reports to the centre. So me as director of estates can look at estates across all of my schools. Me as head teacher for school 3 will see all of the cost centres that are deemed education within that school. And therefore, there isn't much to do from a budgeting perspective. It's budget as normal, but choose who owns the cost centres at each school. And by keeping it that simple, your metrics and KPIs are still there, and you're not kind of creating a funding reallocation model. Or the biggest challenge we see is when we've got all of these schools as locations, and within the central location, we've also got all the schools as cost centres. That kind of two-formed approach for what is a school or a location can get really, really challenging. So I'd be pretty hopeful that most trusts are achieving GAG pooling with fairly minimal changes within their software. It's just really important that you can isolate estates or ICT or whatever that kind of function is horizontally across your schools. Yeah, Ruth, it wasn't just that Bristol Trust. If you look in Schools Week, there's a few. Oh, good, thanks, Jill. There was a few Schools Week articles over the last month around differing top slices between secondary and primary. So if you look, I think there was a bit of a story, I think it was about 4 weeks ago, where they were doing a top slice of X% for their secondaries, which is, say, 10%, and Y for primaries, which is, say, 3%, because of their acknowledgement that their primaries were facing pretty significant challenges in comparison to the secondaries. Okay. I think I've got through all your questions. Thanks all for those that hang on and ask more questions. I've done my best to answer them. You got my details for any more that come through. You'll get access to the paper very shortly. And yeah, anything else, give me a shout. But otherwise, yeah, thanks again for joining this webinar. And yeah, I hope that it was a useful session. And yeah, I'll see you all hopefully very soon.